Well, good evening, everybody. We've all been challenged, Miguel and Tony and I, to take our hour-long presentations from yesterday and boil them down to 25 minutes. And they did a great job. I hope I can, too. I'm going to talk much more about the social and political dimensions of this. And I'm actually going to talk about the subject of the book that we have here, which is called Food Movements Unite, because what we've seen today is that we have a system which clearly doesn't work for most of the world, with profound negative implications moving forward. And then another system which works very well, but needs to be scaled up and scaled out. And so the question is, if it works so well, why hasn't that happened? And that's what I'm going to address. I would submit that in order to bring about these types of very deep transformational changes, we need deep political changes and some very strong political will to bring about these transformations. And that political will is constructed through the pressure of social movements. It's not necessarily a problem that we don't know the technologies, or that we don't have the science, or that we don't know what policies might be effective. But in fact, we just don't have the political will to bring about these sort of changes. So I'm going to be talking about convergence and diversity amongst food movements as a way of bringing about these changes. So if we look at the food riots that Tony mentioned in 2008 and again in 2011, which got a lot of press coverage all around the world, because suddenly we went from about 850 million people being hungry to over 1 billion people going hungry. You see these riots around the world creating political problems, right? In both 2008 and 2011, and they were the result of high prices. Actually, there was enough food for everybody, but people were too poor to buy the food, particularly when we had these tremendous price spikes, the volatility that Tony referred to. In fact, there's been enough food for everybody for quite some time. We've been increasing productivity or production of food around 12% per capita for a number of decades now. And yet the level of hunger and malnutrition have not changed worldwide. That means that even though we produce more and more food per capita, it's a distributional problem. Not everybody is getting the food. Now mostly cows and pigs and automobiles are getting the food. I want to point out that during both of these price spikes, we had more than enough food, we had record hunger, and we also had record profits. And the companies reporting record profits were the very ones which have already been mentioned tonight. Monsanto, Syngenta, ADM, Cargill were making having 20% increase in profits, 86% increase in profits, 45% increase in profits. General Foods, a good sort of indicator of what Walmart was making in profits, 60% increase in profits. At the height of the food crisis, where 1 billion people were going hungry, these corporations were getting very, very rich. Now, this happened in 2008 and again in 2011. And this might seem like a good thing if you're a shareholder, which I don't know how many of you have shares in these companies. Your returns would have increased enormously. However, this is a terrible problem for these companies, because amassing all this wealth, amassing all this capital, they enter into what's called the crisis of capital accumulation, which basically means that they don't know what to do with all their money. And particularly now with the financial crisis, they don't know where to put it. They don't know where to invest in this money. The volatility around the world with everything except IT means that you hang on to your money, you don't want to invest it, but capital doesn't allow you to do that. You've got to reinvest or you go bankrupt, basically. So it turns out that land and food, which is an inelastic commodity, people always need it, is the one place where these companies can invest their profits. right? So suddenly, the very companies which brought about the food crisis, right, with their monocultures, by shoving peasants off the land, are now the ones who are going to save us from hunger, right? Is how it's being constructed. In fact, what they're doing is they're solving their own problem of crisis of capital accumulation. That's what's really behind this tremendous expansion, which you see through the World Food Program, through the FAO, from USAID, from the Feed the Future, from Bill Gates, from the all these myriad of projects which have been unleashed onto the hungry world, coming from what I call the corporate food regime, are basically designed to solve the problem of capital accumulation. Basically, even though we know that, yes, we have a problem with climate, yes, we have a problem with volatility, yes, we have a problem with agrofuels, yes, we have a problem with these food price spikes and whatnot, the root causes of the food crisis and the root causes of hunger are the same. Basically, that we have a very vulnerable food system, which is highly exposed to both economic and environmental shock. Right? Now, this could be a bad thing, unless it is a bad thing, unless you happen to be a monopoly. In which case, you make money when price goes down, and you make money when price goes up. Right? Because when the price goes down, you buy everything up. When the price goes up, you sell. Right? And you can hoard, and you can hang on to things, which is precisely what the grain companies are doing. These grain processors, seed companies, the retail monopolies and whatnot, basically make up what's called the corporate food regime. And if we think about the corporate food regime, it's been constructed over time, and I think Tony was very adamant in that this has been a very long process, that we start with the Green Revolution, which takes the model of petroleum-based agriculture from the north and imposes it on the south. Then move on towards the structural adjustment policies of the 80s and 90s, which prevent countries in the global south from protecting their own agriculture, protecting their markets, forces them to dismantle their grain reserves and open themselves up to northern products. And then the sort of the free trade mania of the free trade agreements, the formation of the WTO, North American Free Trade Agreement, Central American Free Trade Agreement, etc., which then cement into international treaty above national law and above the reach of parliaments and above the reach of citizens these structural adjustment policies which were imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank during the 80s and 90s. And of course, the results from this are that the global south, which at one time produced about $1 billion in the 70s, as late as the 70s, produced $1 billion surplus every year in food, now imports $11 billion of food a year. Industrial agriculture, which we've seen, accounted for 20% of the world's greenhouse gases and using up 80% of the world's water, a loss of 75% of the world's crop diversity. And even though we have an increase in food per capita, we have an equal increase in hungry people, 11, 12%, growing steadily every year. So very clearly, this isn't a system which can solve hunger, but in fact produces hunger. Now, with the food price spikes and the food riots, as they were called, the G20 held a number of summits and decided, we have to fix this because we're having a problem of ungovernability. The Arab Spring was touched off almost in every single country by some sort of food riot. In Tunisia, it was a food vendor who burned himself to death. Right? And this pattern, so what we see is, and in Haiti, where people were subsisting on mud biscuits, people rebel. What we see is that they didn't then storm the warehouses where USAID has all these sacks of rice, a gift from the American people, right, to the Haitians. They didn't storm the warehouses. They stormed the National Palace, right? They stormed the National Palace and they kicked the Prime Minister off the island. So these aren't, empty-headed riots of people with empty bellies and clenched fists. These are political rebellions of people rebelling against the food system and against a government and against a corporate food regime which is incapable of resolving the most elemental problem of here is the food, here is the people, why can't you get the food to the people? They can't do it. Basically, the system doesn't work, can't do it. So the G20 has come up with a number of, I'm looking at the wrong slides, I see, has come up with a number of proposals. And the first thing they said, well, we've got to rebuild agriculture in the global south. And it's going to cost about $40 billion a year, according to the FAO. And then G20 gets together and says, well, we'll give you $22 billion a year. Well, of course, what they want to rebuild is industrial agriculture, but all right, that's a nice gesture. We'll take $20 billion a year. Well, only about 1/20th of that has actually been forthcoming. In other words, the G20 governments are not investing to rebuild agriculture in the global south at all. I mentioned all of these different initiatives to combat hunger. And if you look at these initiatives, what's really striking about them is that the G20 is proposing that we do precisely the things that they have been doing for the last 50 years, the last 30 years at least. Right? So they want more free markets. If free markets have destroyed the capacity for the South to feed themselves, they want more free markets. Right? If the Green Revolution has destroyed the agrobiodiversity in the global South, they want new green revolutions. Right? So in other words, to solve the problem, what they offer is more of the same. Now, what's at stake here, I think, is what we call the another agrarian transition. Now, the first large agrarian transition happened with the Industrial Revolution. And you had the enclosures of the commons and whatnot, and basically you push the peasants off the land and get them to work cheaply in the factories. We have about 2.5 billion smallholders around the world who produce half of the world's food. In large part, they feed themselves. And the idea for the Green Revolution and the idea for the new push, the industrial push, to agricultural lands around the world and all the land grabs and whatnot, is to get these peasants off the land and open this land up to capital. Because we have a crisis of capital accumulation, and capital needs to expand its markets. And if the peasants can provide a new market, it's called the bottom of the pyramid, BOP. If Bill Gates and Monsanto can sell GMO seeds to the peasants of Africa in the first instance, they'll of course do that. But then of course, if they can also grab that land, they'll do that too. And that's precisely what's happening. So the real problem is that we have this agrarian transition in which capitalist agriculture is basically envisioning a reduction of these 2.5 billion farms down to about 50 million farms. 50 million farms with all the best inputs, with all the water, with all the, which they need for their markets, right? They could probably produce that half of food that the world consumes, which the peasantry is now producing. The big question is, where are 2.5 billion peasants supposed to go? We have no new industrial revolution to sop up all this labor. And we're already seeing I would say, the first advance of the Great Migration, which we're facing under this strategy. The millions and millions of peasants who have left the land within the last 20 years, under the free trade agreements in the advance of the new Green Revolution, and have come into Europe and to the United States and whatnot, is just the tip of the iceberg. If capitalist agriculture is allowed to continue. So even the World Bank sometimes commissions studies, which then they're sorry they ever did. But the ISTAT is one. About 400 scientists worked for 4 years on this problem, and they found out that the world is going to have to radically change the way it grows its food if we're going to avoid social breakdown and collapse. And what they found is that GMOs are not an answer. They're a solution looking for a problem. They don't raise intrinsic yields. They aren't able to adequately address climate change. Free trade agreements are in fact detrimental because most of the benefits go to the north and not to the south. And that agroecology is in fact a viable way forward. And it can easily produce, agroecology and small-scale organic, can easily produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. There's many studies done on this. So why doesn't this happen? Well, I talked about the corporate food regime. And if you think about a food regime, think about, this is a concept advanced by Harriet Friedman and David McMichael from University of Toronto and Cornell. Think of all of the rules that govern our food, and all of the institutions, and basically all the monopolies that profit from it. That's a food regime. And it's a regime on a world scale. The first one started with colonialism, in which the South provided cheap food to the North so that the North could industrialize. The second food regime is after World War II, the flow was reversed. The North began to overproduce and had to break down the markets of the South and destroy agriculture in the South in order to locate its products in the South. We're now into a third food regime, which is much more complex. When Cargill is the largest soy producer and processor in Brazil, Cargill is a privately owned family company from the US, the largest. And within the largest company in Brazil producing soybeans, then you realize it's much more complicated. It's not just the North, the South. It's really about this corporate domination of the food system. And so, who are the players? Well, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. What are the rules? Well, the World Trade Organization's rules, the free trade agreements, the US Farm Bill, which sets the price for grain worldwide. These are the rules. And who are the companies? Well, we've been mentioning them. All of the monopolies and oligopolies that control the food system, and increasingly big philanthropy, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, setting the agenda for the future of agriculture. Now, one of the things we know about this corporate food regime is that in the food system is it is a capitalist food system. Now, that may not be news to any of you, but when I say this in the United States, everybody goes, "Oh, that's right." You know, when you live within the empire, really, there's some things that just kind of fly right by you. So, the food regime acts the way a capitalist food regime has to act, which means that, and we know this from Karl Polanyi's work back in the 40s, it goes through periods of reform and liberalization. Right? During a period of liberalization, markets are deregulated, tremendous amount of wealth is concentrated, right? But a tremendous amount of social and environmental damage takes place. Right? Usually to the point where there is a counter movement, a social movement. People can't take it anymore. And they begin to push back, and you get the problem of ungovernability. Right? So if you think about the Roaring '20s, in which markets were unleashed upon the world, and then the crash of 1929, and the tremendous amount of unemployment, and the Dust Bowl, and all these other things which ensued. And in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ushered in the New Deal, right? Which re-regulated markets, re-regulated our financial institutions, pulled the reins back in, and then we lived off the benefits of that New Deal up until the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan unleashed neoliberalism upon the world, right? Because the thing is, if markets were allowed to function indefinitely, they would eventually destroy the social and material basis of the reproduction of capitalism. So it's not that these reformists are terribly visionary. It's that in some ways, they have no choice, because things are falling apart. Governments will fall, as we've already seen in North Africa, and we're seeing increasing discontent around the world. And back in the 1920s and 30s, we also had a big threat, and that was communism. So it wasn't just the fact that the United States might become ungovernable, it was the fact that capitalism might fall, right? And that's when reforms were introduced. So I think this is important when we think about a counter-movement to the corporate food regime. We know that reforms don't come about unless there's a big threat and unless there's a strong counter-movement. Right? And you have to realize that reforms and the reformist trends and the liberalist trends within capital are two sides of the same system. Right? So if we're thinking about really transforming the system into something else, we have to go beyond just reforms. We have to have transformative reforms. So what I'm saying is this is a much more historic, deeper, and wide-ranging sort of proposition than simply planting more organic gardens. Right? In other words, in order to save the food system, we have to reform the economic system. We have to transform the economic system. Now, within the food movement, we have a number of tendencies, just as we have in the corporate food regime. We have the liberal tendency and the reformist tendency. In the food movement, we have the right to food, we have food justice, we have food sovereignty, we have a number of different movements going on all around the world, global north, global south, urban, rural. I don't know how well you can see this matrix back there. But on one side, we have the corporate food regime with the neoliberal tendency and the reformist tendency. They both exist at the same time. The thing is, the neoliberal tendency is in power. It's hegemonic. And they have their own discourse. The neoliberals are very much into food enterprise. The reformists are talking about food security. They have their main institutions, which are basically the same institutions, but they tend to be split. So with the World Bank, for example, you've got the one arm of the World Bank funds the private sector, the other arm of the World Bank funds governments. The private sector arm is much more powerful than the other arm. The other arm is more reformist. The private sector arm is very neoliberal, but they're the strongest. This happens within governments. Within my own country, the United States, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, is mainline neoliberal. Kathleen Merrigan, undersecretary, very reformist, right? But she doesn't have the power he does. Their approach to the food crisis is basically the same, except that the reformists would like to see more safety nets. If you look at the food movements, we have a progressive wing and a very radical wing. And the progressive wing tends to be northern-based, more urban-based, food justice-based, talking much more about organics, about good food, about quality food and whatnot. To some extent talking about food justice. Why don't underserved communities in the richest country in the world have access to food, fresh food? Why are they dying from diet-related diseases from eating all this industrial crap? But really looking for immediate reforms and very much the doers, right? The activist doers, the ones that are growing the gardens and doing farm-to-school programs and these types of things, very much looking at survival and the immediacy of the problems with their own immediate food systems. But then you have the radical wing, which is much more about food sovereignty, which is the democratization of the food system in favor of the poor, and looks at very structural issues. They want to change the rules in the institutions of the corporate food regime. Agriculture out of the WTO, right? Land reform, not land grabs, land reform, redistributive land reform. So very, very structural, very radical in the sense that they go to the root of the structural problems within the food system. So what I want to leave you with for our discussion is we know a couple of things. So we know that we won't be able to usher in reforms and certainly not transformation unless we have a strong counter-movement and a threat. I would submit the threat is probably climate change this time around. The counter-movement coming from the food movements, we have these two wings. But we also know that the corporate food regime flip-flops, or the capitalism flip-flops. It goes through these different periods. And right now what we see is that the reformist trend within the corporate food regime is weak, and in reaching out into the progressive wing of the food movements to try and strengthen its position. It's co-opting, right? So there are alliances being built between the progressives and the reformists. Now, I would submit that this will not lead to reform. I think what this does is it weakens, I'm talking about strategic alliances, not tactical alliances. I think that this weakens the food movement because it splits it between the radicals and the progressives. So I think that the progressives are pivotal in this regard. I think if the progressives steadily build alliances with the radicals, and the radicals have to be open to this too. I mean, they've got to negotiate, right? But if strong progressive radical alliances are built, then I think the food movement is strengthened. And if the food movement is strengthened, then we have the possibility of a strong counter movement which might usher in reforms and maybe even transformative reforms. However, if the progressives build their main strategic alliances with the reformists, then I think nothing changes, basically. Because reforms don't come in because reformists are visionaries. Reforms are long-term historical processes which come about through political will built by social movements. Social force, the power of social movements is what makes this happen. So the question is, everywhere I've gone and sort of constructed this over the last few years, is how can we do that? Samir Amin talks about change in this way, and he says that in the past, when the great reforms were ushered in to capitalism, that was what Gramsci called the first wave. And you remember those political formations, the Vanguard Party, labor unions, all these things. Those were the types of political organizations which ushered in the great reforms to capitalism. The 40-hour work week, for example, right? This type of thing. The controls on the finance sector, etc., on antitrust, the list goes on. However, the problem has been that capitalism has changed. And so these types of political organizations are no longer effective in ushering in reforms. Now, it's not that they're not important. I would be the last person to say that labor unions are not important. They're essential. But those political forms of organization are no longer sufficient. And what we have now is what Gramsci called the second wave, which is much more diverse, much more about civil society, right? And all kinds of demands based on class and gender and north and south and race and on. And these demands have to be addressed. Now, I would say our movements, our social movements, are divided along these lines. This is what divides us. And we need to find ways. The second wave needs to find a way to converge within all its diversity, to overcome the structural divides which we see within our own movements, in our own organizations and sometimes within our own selves. And so what needs to happen is many of these movements have been depoliticized. Depoliticized because the old politics no longer works well. So what we need is a repoliticization of our social movements. And at the same time, we need to find ways to converge in all of our diversity. Because the convergence is a political convergence. Right? And I not only think this is possible, we're already beginning to see this. And I'll end just by giving the example of the book, which you can tell I'm pushing. So I wrote to about 40 food movement leaders around the world, which is sort of the privileged position I have at Food First, to be in contact with all these amazing people. And said, look, I want you to write a chapter for this book on what is to be done. How can we converge in all of our diversity? And most of them answered. Most of them sent back a draft. And not one of them answered the question. Every single one of them wrote to tell me what they were doing. We're from the Brazilian landless workers movement. We do this, we do that, we do the other. We're from the slow food movement. We do this, we do that. I didn't ask you what you're doing. I know what you're doing. I'm asking you about the larger movement. What is to be done? From your perspective. I want your opinion, but don't just talk about yourself. I sent all the manuscripts back. 18 of them were returned. The authors really answered the question. I thought, we haven't thought about this enough. We really have not thought about this enough. If these leaders, who are my teachers in many ways, hadn't even stopped to think about this question, and now they're beginning to think about it, it really is a task. If it was easy, we'd have already done it. It's going to be difficult. But I think that they came up with some very interesting perspectives and suggestions. And just the fact that we have them all in one book, I think, is just a good signal for convergence. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.